The world had changed forever. Once it had been a paradise, lush, vibrant, and filled with the presence of God. Adam and Eve had walked freely in the Garden of Eden, surrounded by the beauty of God's perfect creation. But that was before sin entered the world, before the forbidden fruit was eaten, before they were cast out into a land of toil, pain, and suffering. Banished from Eden, Adam and Eve struggled to rebuild their lives. They had known perfection, and now they knew sorrow. They had 2 sons, Cain and Abel, and they hoped their children would continue the legacy of worshipping and obeying God. But tragedy struck when Cain, filled with jealousy and rage, murdered his brother Abel. The first blood had been spilled, and death, the terrible consequence of sin, became a reality for mankind. The pain of losing Abel was unbearable for Eve. She had carried him in her womb, nurtured him, and watched him grow, only to lose him in the cruelest way imaginable. And worse, her other son Cain was cursed and driven away, a wanderer on the earth. Adam and Eve were left childless once more, their hearts burdened with grief. But God, in his mercy, had not abandoned them. He saw their sorrow and gave them a promise of restoration. One day a son would be born who would continue the godly line that had been lost with Abel, a son through whom righteousness would be preserved. That son was Seth. When Eve conceived again, she felt a divine assurance that this child was special. When he was born, she named him Seth, saying, "God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him." Genesis 4:25. The name Seth means appointed or granted. He was more than just another son. He was a sign of God's faithfulness. He was a child of promise, a symbol that God's plan for humanity would not be destroyed by sin. Seth was born in a world vastly different from Eden. His birthplace was likely in the rugged lands east of Eden, where Adam and Eve had settled after their exile. Life was difficult. They had to toil for their survival. Yet despite their struggles, Seth was raised with a deep understanding of God's ways. His parents taught him about the Garden of Eden, about how they once walked with God, and about the terrible mistake that led to their fall. They warned him about sin, the importance of obedience, and the promise that one day a Redeemer would come to crush the serpent's head and restore what had been lost. Seth's birth was not just the beginning of a new family line, it was the beginning of hope. He was the child through whom God's promise would continue, and through him, the righteous lineage that would one day lead to Noah, Abraham, David, and ultimately Jesus Christ was established. From the moment of his birth, Seth was different. Unlike his brother Cain, who carried the curse of his rebellion, and unlike Abel, whose life had been tragically cut short, Seth was chosen by God to be the foundation of a righteous lineage. His birth was more than just a personal blessing to Adam and Eve. It was a divine statement that sin would not have the final word. Adam and Eve, though banished from Eden, had not abandoned their faith in God. They raised Seth with deep reverence for the Creator, who had formed them from the dust and breathed life into them. They told him about the Garden of Eden, the tree of life, and the terrible day when disobedience brought suffering upon the world. They taught him the ways of worship, sacrifice, and obedience to God, lessons they had learned through painful experience. Seth grew up watching his parents work the land, laboring under the curse that had made the earth yield its fruit through toil and sweat. He saw his mother endure pain in childbirth, a constant reminder of humanity's fallen state. Yet, despite the hardships, Seth was raised in a home filled with faith and the hope of God's promise. He learned from his father Adam, who had once walked with God and spoke of his glory firsthand. As Seth grew into adulthood, the world around him descended into greater darkness. The descendants of Cain, his brother who had been cursed and sent away, built cities and filled the earth with violence, immorality, and rebellion. Cain's lineage pursued wealth, music, craftsmanship, and the power of civilization, but they rejected God. They turned their backs on their Creator and sought their own ways. But Seth was different. Unlike Cain's family, Seth and his descendants remained faithful to God. Genesis 4:26 gives us a powerful glimpse into the impact of Seth's life. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This means that under Seth's leadership and influence, public worship of God was revived. His family did not follow the way of Cain, but instead sought to restore what had been lost in Eden, a relationship with God. Seth's descendants became known as the sons of God, a term later used to describe those who walked in righteousness. Through Seth, a spiritual revival took place. His family became the keepers of true faith in a world growing darker by the day. His legacy was one of obedience, devotion, and perseverance in the face of increasing wickedness. God's plan for salvation would continue through Seth's bloodline. Though the world would soon face judgment in the days of Noah, the righteous remnant, the ones who still called on the Lord, came from Seth. Seth's role was not one of earthly power or conquest, but of spiritual leadership. He became the first patriarch of faith, standing in contrast to the corruption around him. His name was recorded in the lineage of Jesus Christ, Luke 3:38, proving that through him, the ultimate Savior of the world would one day come. Seth's life was a reminder that God's promises never fail, even in the midst of sin and judgment. As Seth grew into a man, he witnessed the stark contrast between two distinct paths unfolding before him, the way of Cain and the way of righteousness. While Cain's descendants built cities, pursued wealth, and indulged in violence, immorality, and rebellion against God, Seth and his family sought something different. Seth understood that the world was not as it was meant to be. The land, once a paradise, was now cursed. Death was a reality. Sin had spread like a disease, corrupting the hearts of men. But through his father, Adam, he learned that God had made a promise that one day a Redeemer would come to crush the head of the serpent and restore what had been lost. Genesis 3:15. Seth knew that his role was to preserve the knowledge of God and pass it down to future generations. Seth eventually married and had children. Though the Bible does not give us the name of his wife, she was likely one of Adam and Eve's many descendants, as humanity was still in its earliest stages. His most notable son, Enosh, was born when Seth was 105 years old, Genesis 5:6. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord, Genesis 4:26. This statement signifies a turning point in human history. Though Adam and Eve had known God personally, and though Abel had offered pleasing sacrifices to him, public worship was now being established. Before this, the knowledge of God had been passed down privately from Adam to his children. But now, Seth and his descendants initiated a corporate expression of faith, an open public declaration of their devotion to God. This was the birth of the faithful remnant, the line that would carry God's promise forward. The descendants of Seth did not just know about God. They worshipped him, called upon his name, and sought his guidance. At the same time, Cain's descendants were expanding their influence. They built civilizations, developed agriculture, music, and metalworking, and became known for their arrogance, violence, and disregard for God. Lamech, one of Cain's descendants, boasted of murder and took multiple wives, further distancing his family from God's design. Genesis 4:23-24. But Seth's family remained distinct. They lived simple, faithful lives, walking with God in obedience. The two family lines grew side by side, but only one sought the Lord. This contrast between righteousness and rebellion foreshadowed a greater spiritual battle that would continue throughout history, a struggle between those who follow God and those who reject him. Seth's descendants became the patriarchs of faith, carrying on the knowledge of God while the world became increasingly wicked. Through him came Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and eventually Noah. the man who would be chosen by God to survive the great flood. If not for Seth's faithfulness, the world may have completely turned away from God. But because he and his family stood firm in their devotion, the promise of a coming Redeemer remained alive. The world was changing. Darkness was spreading. But through Seth and his children, God's light still shined. As the years passed, humanity split into two distinct spiritual paths, the godly line of Seth and the rebellious line of Cain. This division was more than just a difference in families. It was a battle between righteousness and wickedness, faith and rebellion, light and darkness. Seth's family sought to preserve the knowledge of God and remained devoted to worshipping him. Cain's descendants, on the other hand, drifted further into violence, pride, and self-sufficiency, rejecting God and embracing a life without him. After Cain killed his brother Abel, he was cursed by God and sent away to wander the earth. But instead of repenting, Cain chose to build a civilization without God. He established the first city, named Enoch, after his son, Genesis 4:17. This city became a symbol of human independence from God, a place of growing sin and lawlessness. Cain's descendants became innovators, developing cities, music, agriculture, and metallurgy. However, instead of using these gifts to glorify God, they used them to build a society of pride, violence, and immorality. One of the most infamous descendants of Cain was Lamech, who not only introduced polygamy, twisting God's design for marriage, but also boasted of murder, declaring that he was even more violent than Cain, Genesis 4:23-24. His arrogance and brutality reflected the spiritual degeneration of Cain's lineage. This line pursued pleasure, power, and earthly success, but at the cost of losing their connection to God. They multiplied in numbers, but grew distant from their Creator. In stark contrast to Cain's family, Seth's descendants remained devoted to God. Unlike Cain's children, who sought fame and power, Seth's family preserved faith and worship. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This marked the revival of true worship led by Seth and his son Enosh. While Cain's descendants were building earthly kingdoms, Seth's descendants were seeking a heavenly kingdom. They understood that the world was filled with corruption, yet they remained faithful. They prayed, worshipped, and passed down the knowledge of God from one generation to the next. Among Seth's descendants were Enoch, who walked with God and was taken to heaven without dying, Genesis 5:24, and Noah, the righteous man through whom God would preserve humanity during the flood. The stark contrast between these two family lines symbolized a spiritual battle that continues throughout history. The battle between those who choose God and those who reject him. Cain's line represented a world that seeks fulfillment apart from God, relying on human strength and ambition. Seth's line represented a people who depended on God, walking in faith and righteousness. The tension between these two ways of life grew stronger as sin increased on the earth, but God always preserved a remnant, a group of people who remained faithful, no matter how dark the world became. Seth's legacy was not about power or wealth. It was about keeping the light of faith alive in a world growing ever darker, and through his line the promise of a coming Savior would remain unbroken. As the generations of Seth grew and multiplied, they became known as the Sons of God, a title that distinguished them from the sinful descendants of Cain. They were not angels or supernatural beings, as some later interpretations suggest, but rather righteous men who remained faithful to God in an increasingly corrupt world. Through Seth's lineage, the knowledge of God was preserved, and the promise of salvation remained alive. While Cain's descendants built cities filled with rebellion and violence, Seth's descendants carried forward the hope that one day a Redeemer would come to crush the serpent's head, fulfilling the prophecy given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3:15. One of the most significant events in Seth's lineage was the birth of his son, Enosh. When Enosh was born, the Bible records a powerful statement. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Genesis 4:26. This simple verse marks a spiritual awakening. Up until this point, individuals like Abel had worshipped God through sacrifices, and Adam and Eve had taught their children about him. But under Enosh's leadership, corporate worship was introduced. People began publicly calling on God's name, praying and worshipping as a community. This was the beginning of organized faith in a world growing more wicked by the day. Seth's family understood that their mission was not just to survive, but to keep the worship of God alive and pass it down to their children. While Seth's descendants remained devoted to God, the world around them became increasingly corrupt. Cain's family continued to multiply, spreading their influence throughout the earth. The two lines, the sons of God, Seth's descendants, and the sons of men, Cain's descendants, lived side by side, but they followed vastly different paths. Cain's lineage pursued wealth, power, and earthly pleasure, rejecting God. They filled the world with violence and sin, leading humanity further away from the Creator. Lamech, a descendant of Cain, became the first recorded polygamist and boasted of his murderous ways, Genesis 4:23-24, showing just how far his line had fallen into depravity. Seth's line, on the other hand, remained devoted to God. His descendants included some of the most righteous figures in early human history. Enoch, who walked with God and was taken to heaven without experiencing death, Genesis 5:24. Methuselah, the longest living man in the Bible, Genesis 5:27. Noah, the man through whom God would save humanity from destruction, Genesis 6:9. These men stood as beacons of faith in a dark world, but despite their efforts to keep God's truth alive, sin continued to spread. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Many interpretations exist about who these sons of God were. Some believe they were fallen angels, but the most consistent biblical interpretation is that they were the descendants of Seth, who began to intermarry with the corrupt descendants of Cain, the daughters of men. This union led to a great moral and spiritual decline. The faithful line of Seth, which had once stood apart, began to compromise. They were influenced by the sinful ways of Cain's family, and their faith was weakened. This blending of righteous and wicked lines accelerated the corruption of humanity until God saw that. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Genesis 6:5. God was grieved by what had happened. The world had become so corrupt that he decided to bring judgment through a great flood. But even in this dark time, one man stood out, Noah, the descendant of Seth, who found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Seth's role in biblical history was not just about being Adam's son, it was about preserving the promise of God. Though his descendants eventually compromised, his lineage remained the foundation of hope. Through Seth's line came Noah, Abraham, David, and ultimately Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Seth's story is a reminder that God always keeps a faithful remnant even in the darkest times. His life and the lives of his descendants show us that faithfulness to God is the most important legacy anyone can leave behind. As Seth's descendants multiplied, they stood as a contrast to the growing sinfulness of the world. While Cain's lineage pursued self-glory, violence, and rebellion against God, Seth's family sought to remain faithful to their Creator. They were the first to publicly worship God, establishing a pattern of devotion that would shape the future of faith. This chapter explores how Seth and his descendants led a revival of true worship, keeping God's presence alive in a world growing darker with sin. In the beginning, worship was pure and unbroken. Adam and Eve lived in direct communion with God in the Garden of Eden. They did not need altars or sacrifices. They walked face to face with their Creator, experiencing His presence in a way humanity would never again fully know. But sin broke that relationship. Disobedience separated mankind from God, and Adam and Eve were cast out into a world filled with toil, suffering, and death. Though they no longer walked with God in the garden, they did not forget Him. Adam taught his children to worship, and Abel offered sacrifices that pleased God. Genesis 4:4. However, after Cain killed Abel and was cursed, true worship was nearly lost. Cain's descendants rejected God, and the world grew increasingly corrupt. For a time, it seemed that mankind had turned away completely. Then, something changed. When Seth's son Enosh was born, a powerful statement was recorded in Scripture. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Genesis 4:26. This moment marked a spiritual revival. While individual worship had existed before, this was the first recorded instance of collective public worship. The phrase, calling on the name of the Lord, suggests more than just prayer. It indicates a gathering of people openly proclaiming their faith in God. This was likely when formal acts of worship, such as prayer, sacrifices, and teaching, became established traditions. The faith of Seth's family became a movement, standing in opposition to the godlessness of Cain's descendants. For the first time since Eden, people worshipped together, creating a community of faith. Though the Bible does not give details on how Seth's descendants worshipped, we can infer that their practices were like those seen later in biblical history. 1. Sacrifices and offerings. Like Abel, who brought a pleasing sacrifice to God, Genesis 4:4, Seth's family likely continued the practice of offering the best of their livestock and crops to God. These sacrifices symbolized dependence on God and pointed forward to the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. 2. Prayer and calling on God's name. Public prayer became a defining trait of Seth's lineage. Unlike Cain's descendants, who relied on their own strength, Seth's family sought God in all things. 3. Teaching and passing down faith. Adam lived for over 900 years, meaning he was alive to personally teach Seth and many generations after him about God's ways. Seth and his children ensured that the knowledge of the true God was passed down, preserving faith through generations. 4. Moral and righteous living. While Cain's line became known for polygamy, murder, and arrogance, Seth's descendants were recognized for their righteousness and devotion. The Bible later refers to them as the sons of God, Genesis 6:2, distinguishing them from the corrupt daughters of men. The establishment of public worship under Seth was more than just a religious gathering. It was a resistance against sin and corruption.